Hi, good evening. This is the NYRSF, the New York Review of Science Fiction Readings. We are very honored tonight to have as our guests E. Lily Yu and Amal El-Mohtar. But first, a few notes. Um, t- the, the next reading for us is going to be the first Tuesday of May, May 3rd, when we'll have Robert V.S. Reddick. We haven't yet booked June. We're hoping to. And we are considering a summer vacation while we find out which way the plague is blowing. We'd love to be in person again, but we are still holding off a little bit. My name is Barbara Krasnoff. I am going to be your temporary host. Jim Freund is producer. Amy Goldschlager is going to be our audience wrangler. And we would like to give our thanks to Martin Cahill, who helped put together this event on behalf of Erewhon Books. And all this is brought to you by Hour of the Wolf, Jim's program, which is now on Mondays at 9 p.m. No, it's not really brought to you by, but I thought I'd mention it anyways. He is now 9 p.m. on Mondays instead of absurdly early hours on weekends. So come listen to him on WBAI if you'd like. Okay, I am not going to be on very long. I would like to introduce our conversationalists. E. Lily Yu is a writer and a narrative designer whose fiction has appeared in places such as McSweeney's, Boston Review, Clark's World, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and the Best Science Fiction and Fantasy of the Year. Amal El-Mohtar is an award-winning writer of fiction, poetry, and criticism. She is in the science fiction and fantasy columnist for the New York Times Book Review and the co-author with Max Gladstone of This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is a wonderful book, by the way, and which has received several honors, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. She teaches creative writing at the University of Ottawa. You can find her online at her site at amalelmohtar.com or subscribe to her newsletter at the same site. And now I am honored to present E. Lily Yu and Amal El-Mohtar.
Hooray! Hello! It looks like we're both here. I think
we're both here.
We're both here. Great. Excellent. Lily, it's so good to see you. It's so good to see your face.
It's really good to see yours.
So I thought I would just let you take it away with a reading to start with from this book that I adore so much. And then we could chat about it afterwards or chat about just anything that comes up in the wake of it.
Chips and shoes and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. All right, I'm reading from my first novel, On Fragile Waves, which came out a year and a month ago from Erewhon Books. I'll be reading chapter 13. It is very short. It is very quick. Upon their resettlement in Australia, Jawed and Khairullah had first bunked in a 9-person flat, 3 men to a room, with people coming and going constantly, so the 2 beds in each room never cooled. For all its noise, for all that they had to pass sideways in the corridor, that flat had been fitted with a precious landline. The residents dropped coins into the jar beside the phone whenever they called home, wherever home was. Then there had been a 3-person flat, a quieter and easier place to sleep, where Jawed and Khairullah shared a prepaid mobile. Once a week, between construction jobs, they called home and told Nasima about the shops that sold lollies in every color, and the brilliant blue water of the Indian Ocean, like a jewel set in a bezel of white sand. They assured their parents, and were reassured in turn, that the entire family was in good health, no troubles at all. Then the boys told their parents how much to expect that week. It was Khairullah, the older one, who had the idea of buying a package of lollies each time one or the other had $1 to spare. Box by box and bar by bar, they assembled a small wall of sweets in their room. Every time Khairullah added a violet crumble or a bag of strawberry clouds to the pile, he put his fists on his hips and laughed. "I can see her now," he said. "Can't you?" When Nasima arrived, she would rip wrappers and tear apart paper boxes, eating until her tongue was striped green and blue and her upper lip smeared with chocolate. Jawed, 3 years younger than Khairullah, examined the expiration dates, and when they were a day or two away, would bring the chocolate bar or cherry ripe to his brother and pull a pleading face. "Oh, all right," Khairullah always said. They split the lollies between them, tasting tart heartedness on their tongues. The last call thrummed their mobile while they were on the bus to work. "We're leaving," Nassima said breathlessly. Then their father commandeered the phone. "Thank you for the money," he said. "Do not send any more. We've made arrangements with the man who smuggled you. All of us will join you in Australia, in that place you said. Perth. We'll call when we go." 2 days later, Jawed dropped their mobile into the sea. Khairullah had suggested they walk the 15 kilometers from Scarborough to their flat in Mosman Park to save on fares. Jawed had resisted, then insisted on taking the beach, never mind the sand infiltrating their shoes and gritting the skin between their toes. The water gleamed turquoise and tourmaline. Within 10 minutes, Jawed had run out onto one of the rocky moles that jutted out into the sea, whooping and leaping like a man possessed. On either side of him, waves flung up fans of feathery lace. Water pooled in the hollows of the barnacled rocks. Jawed turned to Khairullah, arms wide. Then his foot skidded. He slipped and splayed. The mobile slid from his pocket, rebounded off a rock, and fell into the sea. "Ah, fuck," Jawed said, feeling his bruised bum. Another wave shattered over him, and spray dripped in rivulets down his dark hair. Khairullah advanced onto the rocks, legs locked, hands braced for a fall. The sight of so much water still frightened him. "Idiot!" he shouted. "Are you hurt?" "Oh, it hurts everywhere." I'll come get you." Khairullah edged forward along the mole, prodding each algal rock to test its slickness. "Nah, I'm fine." Jawed crawled to his feet and hobbled and hopped to his brother. "Nothing broken?" "Nope. But I lost the mobile." "You lost the— Didn't you see? Boop boop. There it went. It's a shame about the credit. I think we had 75 cents left." Khairullah punched him in the gut. He doubled over. "Ah, what was that for?" "Did you write down Baba's number anywhere?" "It's on the phone." "Oh. And when they call the number they have for us again, maybe a fish will pick up," Jawed said. "Even if we had the money, which we don't, even if we bought and loaded a new mobile straight away, how in the world would we call them? Won't they be traveling for a while? They might not even think to call. They said they'd call right before they left." "Oh, right. Now they'll think we're what, dead, in prison, sick, hurt? Maman will think all those things at once. She'll fling her hands over her face and wail, 'Oh, my children, is there no God? Sick, hurt, dead, and imprisoned. How much can a mother bear?'" "You have no right to make jokes," Khairullah said. "You've lost our mobile and Baba's number." "What, do you want me to dive for it?" "Lala, I don't want to. The water's cold." Khairullah folded his arms and thought. "We'll have to hope they try the old number, and that someone at the flat figures it out. Do we have Zaman's contact?" "Yes, I saved it on the phone." Khairullah kicked a vicious arc of sand. "It's like they're in space, and we've lost the signal," he said. "They can't reach us. We can't reach them. So how—" "I'll take a bus to our old place," Jawed said, squeezing his brother's shoulder. "Someone will remember me. I'll ask them to tell Baba if he calls, and to write down his number and give it to us. They still have to think of calling the old place." "They will. Before they call a funeral director, at least. What did I say about joking, eh? I'm serious." "Fine. And if you weren't being serious?" "I'd say we buy all the chocolate in Perth and put it in a pile. Nassima will find us by the smell, straight across the ocean, dragging the boat. Hello, troublemakers. Where are the lollies you promised me?" She must have grown. What if she's grown as tall as your chin? Or taller? What if she grows taller than you? Then she's eating well. I'll punch anyone who complains. The dunes on their left bristled with spinifex and saltbush, striped here and there with paths to the road. Glowering rain clouds stitched themselves to the sea. They walked side by side, Jawed whistling, Khairullah staring west through the clouds, past the heartbreaking blue of the ocean. He looked until he saw the whitewashed rooms of the family home and the trees in the compound, a crooked almond and a spreading pear, and a little girl climbing into the pear for a nest full of speckled eggs. "They'll find us," Khairullah said, shivering. "They must." "Is that rain?" "Let's walk faster." When they had gone, a raindrop fell and cratered the white sand. Then another. Soon the double line of footprints washed away.
That was wonderful. Thank you so, so much for that. Oh, there we go. I'm taking stock over my face on the screen.
We shrink and we grow.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that. That was so wonderful. And I especially love that you read that chapter because it is, these are characters who sort of glance against the core narrative, right? This is a book that is mostly focused on one family, but in these latter parts, in these latter chapters, you start getting glimpses of people who orbit that family in some way or another. And there's just, that is so much part for me of the effect of this book, is this kind of, the fact that it opens, I mean, it's called On Fragile Waves, and it opens with this evocation of radio waves. And it does sort of tune into these channels of other people's lives besides the core family. And I find that tremendously beautiful and tremendously affecting. So I thought I wanted to start by asking you, it has been a year since this book came out, and goodness knows the world keeps simultaneously changing enormously, and also forcing us to keep very still. And I'm sort of just wondering, if you'd like to talk about it, how has the experience of this year with your book in the world been? I know that it took you a very long time to write, that you dwelt with it for a very long time. So now that it's out in the world, how has that experience been for you?
Multiple layers to the answer. I'm trying to sort them out. There was a relief, first of all, that it made it out into the world in the first place. All credit to Liz Gorinsky for the title, and also for having the courage to take the book out into the world. It was a tremendous risk, and Liz had the courage to bring it off. It would not have been published if it were not for Liz and Erewhon. So I am first of all just relieved and grateful that the book made it out the door, despite printing delays, despite freight and shipping delays. There were no books in bookstores on the launch date, except for the 2 bookstores that I was reading at. I don't think there were books in bookstores for like 3 weeks to a month after the book launched. And I just have a deep gratitude for every single person who helped bring the book into the world. And there's a lot of folks at Erewhon. I'm going to make you blush now, because one part of the book coming out into the world was just being staggered over and over by the great generosity of critics, of reviewers like yourself, of librarians. But I actually asked Martin to arrange this conversation because I do not think there has been anyone who has done the book greater kindness than you. Erewhon is this tiny upstart press that only started March 2020, and I think if it were not for the critics, and especially you, the book would have just disappeared like a rock thrown into water, just vanished like ripples. As to the rest of the year, it has been the situation of the world has been excruciating repeatedly in more ways than one. I could see what was going to happen, what did happen in August as far back as April. It still came much more quickly than I expected. And I think what hurts even more now is how quickly people have forgotten. The situation on the ground right now is very, very bad. And we have, in the US, taken the reserves of the National Bank of Kabul, and we're going to split it among 9/11 survivors and their lawyers, which is not at all an honorable or a just thing to do to the world's poorest nation. Not that there are easy answers to anything, but I think that was a particular moment of feeling great shame for who we are as a country. And what's happening right now in Europe, in Ethiopia, there's never just one place at once. The one thing one thing you can say is that people are going to suffer. Their people are suffering. There's no amount of idealism. There's no amount of anything called a just war that will remove that fact. And I think that's very hard to look at. And that's been the year.
No, I wanted to say, I'm sorry to start us off with such a sort of dark question, but the one of the, so I'm going to sort of answer what you said in multiple prongs. On the first prong, I want to say that, you know, as a critic, my response to this book felt extremely involuntary. Like, I felt like I just put myself into the hands of this book, and it just did things to me. It just it affected me more than any book I can remember. You know, no, the last book that I can remember that made me cry as hard and as just sort of helplessly, I guess, as this did, was probably a very different book, Elizabeth Wine's Codename Verity, probably, and in probably partly, I mean, they're both tragedies and stuff like that. There's a lot of tremendous feeling, but on Fragile Waves, what felt a lot more personal to me, and personal from an angle of being the child of immigrants, of being raised with the awareness of what sort of propulsed my family into Canada in the first place, but also an awareness of how much unfairness and injustice is ongoing in the world, and how, even though I am not Afghani, I have no elements of my family have their roots in Afghanistan. There was so much between sometimes just the fact that, you know, the word for father, you know, just saying Baba, which is what I call my father, or there's this part really wrecks me, and forgive me if I start sort of tearing up as I talk about this, but there's towards the end of the book, I think there's a phrase that introduces storytelling. I can't remember if it happens at the beginning as well, but it's you know, it's like from time before time or something like that. And I had this very shocking reaction to it, which was to realize that it was a translation of something that my parents said to me when they told me stories as a child. And I had never translated it in my head into English because it just felt like a stock Arabic phrase. I had never put it into those words. And I realized that that's what it was. And my brain sort of short-circuited. And so in all of these angles, it sort of felt like it hit me in places where I never expected novels in English to be able to touch, essentially, because these felt like very private instances in my family and stuff, and to see them in this book was tremendous. But the other thing about it, I think part of the reason it hit me as hard as it did, is that this is a book that looks at that breadth of experience of displaced families, of families displaced by war and imperialism, the actions of imperial powers in the world, and it allows them. It makes room for this multifaceted sort of glimpse of how we treat each other as well, especially in the Australia chapters, once they are actually off of Nauru and on the mainland. The fact that there are glimpses from like the student who goes to visit them periodically, whose name I've now forgotten, I'm sorry. But there's, you know, all of these other lives, essentially, and where the core family's story intersects with them felt like just this sequence of small explosions in my heart, of just like revelation after revelation. And I just feel like there is so much that I learned from this book. And it also made me aware of how many things I had been trying not to think about, or simply, you know, flinching from in my own life and in our like just our own kind of movement through the world and through trying to communicate about things. Where was I going with this? I had a direction I was going. Mostly this is just to say that it's also, I recognize that there is a difficulty to, I find anyway, this feels like an almost unfair thing to say, and I don't mean it to be unfair, but it's just a thing that I've observed. It is harder to recommend books in, the kind of genre community of my heart when they're devastating. Like it is hard to be able to say to people who I think are used to seeing me in particular recommend, like, look at all this great representation in this book, hooray, like some great queer romances or some like lovely things that are nice that will make you feel good and stuff. And then for me to come and say, yeah, this book will make you cry very hard and make it impossible for you to do anything but sort of stare at a wall for a little while as you process the world and stuff like that. It's difficult to recommend it in the same sorts of environment. And yet it feels so necessary to read it. And I can't help but think that, like, this is my experience of reading it. I sort of try to approximate what the experience of dwelling with it as an author for, the years that you did and stuff could have been like. And I can't get there. Like, I've read what you've written about living with it and working on it and stuff, but I'm going to try and find a way to a question through this. But
I have a question for you. Was it Ruzi Ruzhoya, like One Day Among Days, or Yakibud Yakinabud, Once There Was, Once There Wasn't? That was the opening.
Once there was, once there was, once there wasn't. That's what it was. We say Kenya Makin min Kenya Makin min Abl Zaman, I think. So it was Kenya Makin in the first place. I don't think I'd ever understood it as a child, as it means like was and wasn't. To me, it always sounded like it just sounded like a rhyme, like a sort of in the way that in ballads, you have a refrain like I don't know, oh, the dreadful wind and rain, or green grow the rushes, oh, or something like that. I was like, oh, Kenya Makin, just a sort of placeholder. And then I realized, no, it literally means there was and there wasn't. And bringing that dimension to it was like, wow, it transformed my own memories of essentially of those stories.
It's probably the most honest statement of the passage between not reading or not hearing a story and into story, into fiction. It's like, yet there's a kind of reality, but it's not physical, factual reality. And so to be able to say once there was and once there wasn't as an honest signal of, I'm going to tell you something that you should not take as a factual statement, but there is truth in there if you're looking for it.
I love that so much, especially because one of the things about this book that I find tremendous and necessary, not just within the world, but within our genre conventions, within science fiction and fantasy, I think that we have a lot of valorizing and love for the idea of a story, right? The idea that stories save us, stories rescue us, and so on, right? And this is a book that really challenges that. And I feel like that even coming at it from this place of, there was and there wasn't, having that unstable assertion at the beginning really erodes the ground under like the feet of that kind of statement of like, yes, stories will save us, stories will rescue us, as instead of like recognizing that stories are also potentially insidious and potentially damaging and potentially powerful in the wrong directions and wielded by the wrong people and stuff like that. So I don't know, I'd love to hear you speak to that actually, if you want to.
I think it was Lynn Hunt's, I cannot remember the book on human rights and how the novel helped, I have yet to read it, how the novel beginning in the 19th century helped create the idea of human rights. And so there's been, I believe that book has a much more complex argument than the bromides that we tell each other now as writers of, I'm sorry, these are my opinions, I'm an individual, they are very outre opinions, but writers love to say, reading builds empathy, it makes me a better person, storytelling will save us, all we need is representation. I think all of these are absolutely false. all of these are absolutely false. First of all, there's the fact that the publishing industry is something like 82% white. And if you look at the children's book demographics, it is overwhelmingly white. And so if we take for granted that fiction cultivates empathy, well, then the obvious conclusion is that we're cultivating an excess of empathy for certain groups and a massive deficit of empathy for others.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure that I can argue that fiction creates empathy. Hannah Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem reminds us that there were plenty of members of the Third Reich who loved reading poetry and fiction, loved listening to music, and were completely involved in eradicating an entire population. I also see readers in indulging in some pretty vicious behavior sometimes, and so I don't think that books are going to save us. I don't think that books make us better people. I don't think that all stories are good or that all books are good. I was having a bit of a disagreement with the pastor on this, on the uses of storytelling, and my argument here is that for women, if you ever hear a man coming up to you with a story, my wife doesn't understand me, she's so awful, run, you run. That is not a good story. You do not listen to that story. You do not give that person, you run. There's stories like that. We tell all kinds of harmful stories. Storytelling is a neutral tool. It's a human behavior, and we can use it for good, and we can use it for ill, and we can use it to entertain ourselves, and we can use it to heal. For me, at this point, I no longer really read to be entertained. I read for the kind of books that expand my understanding of the world, that create meaning out of what can be so chaotic and so meaningless that it leads us to despair. Life gives us so much that is absolutely crushing. And if there is work that can bring joy or beauty, that is plenty for me. If there's work that can knit together shattering experiences into something meaningful and whole, that is something I admire tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually reading less and less in the last, say, 10 to 15 years that really satisfies me. I'm seeing a movement toward books as content, books as products, and less as books as assistance to the construction of meaning that helps us to live in higher and better ways. The books that I can think of that do this are The Bone People by Carrie Holm, Possession by A.S. Byatt, Little Big by John Crowley. There's music that does this. There are some books that put you back together and put the world back together in a way that it's more possible and it's a little easier to get to the next day, to have a little hope. And that's what I'm looking for mostly these days. Stories that are not just written to be written, not just written to be sold, but that give something necessary for just the hard work of getting from day to day.
You know, this is so interesting to me for a couple of reasons. And one of them, oh, wait, I see a question thrown up on the screen, but I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be reading them now or if we're holding them for later. I think I'll hang on to this for now. I think it's a lovely question from Gretchen. I don't know if that actually appeared on the broadcast screen or not, but anyway, I'll hang on to them for now. Would love to get viewer questions afterwards, but I'm trying to remember that this is going to be audio archive as well. So I will try to make sure to externalize things more. Anyway, no, I love what you're saying about reading. And so this is an interesting thing, right? I have a sort of, I think I completely agree with you in what you're saying, but I find that I want to articulate a slightly different angle of it, which is that I think, how can I put this? I sort of almost want to make a distinction between stories and reading in terms of activities and what we do and how we process them. Partly because I often feel like reading not necessarily that it makes me a better person, but that I feel like I am my best self when I'm reading, if that makes sense. That I feel like when I am alone with a book, and there's a relationship that is forming between me and the words, regardless of what that relationship is, whether I am loving the book, whether I am irritated with the book, whether I am interested in the book or bored by the book, I feel like I am activated in a way that I really treasure and that I want to sort of protect the experience of, because I feel very disturbed by an idea of reading as a purely passive act, as like a sort of passive consumption. To me, when my experience of reading is a very active state. When I read things, I get agitated. I want to walk around and talk about the things that I'm reading. I want to scribble in the margins. I want to think about the things that I'm reading and stuff. And that's something that I treasure. I don't think that's necessarily how everyone reads. It's not how I always read, for that matter. I can absolutely passively consume something for entertainment and pleasure and stuff as well. But it occurs to me that that talking about stories and talking about books as content and stuff, drat, I totally had a thought and it's flown from my mind. You know what it is? This is what it is. I find myself, I don't know if you feel this way, I find myself turning a lot to books that are 20 to 30 years older than, or 20 to 30 years old, I should say. Things that came out 20 to 30 years ago as a sort of relief from reading things that are coming out in the next 6 months and stuff like that. Not because of quality, I should hasten to say, but because of the context, because of the conversation around them, because my job is, to be, is as a sort of cog in a hype cycle machine. And a lot of the time, I'm constantly receiving blasts from publicists of different things and stuff, and everyone trying to, package this content in ways that will be palatable to whoever it's being sent to and stuff. And sometimes to palate cleanse, I just want to read things from 30 years ago that I have no idea about the context of the publication. I have no idea what they were in conversation with. I have no idea what was going on at that moment in time to kind of produce this book. And it just feels like this sort of enormous quiet just washes over everything. And I feel like I can have that very active relationship with a book again, because it's bringing me I don't know, it brings me wonder, it brings me a bunch of things. I've just remembered something that I was trying to say, which was that I'm also reading Plato's Republic for the first time all the way through, as opposed to like excerpts on a university course. And I find myself also sort of perturbed by the fact that I read some chapters of it and I'm like, oh, is this about fanfic on the internet, or is this about, like, it's just, there are some aspects of the idea that if you write something, you change the world by representing in your story the world that you want. And I think that this is also a very seductive thing that writers tell each other, that, we can change the world by writing the world that we want and stuff. I'm positive I have said this at some point in the last 20 years and sincerely believed it. But what disturbs me lately is how that sort of axiom becomes flipped on its head and instead becomes, we must not have in our fiction anything that we do not want to see in the world. And that's straight out of Plato. Like, that is absolutely an argument of very long vintage. Yes, let's just kick out all of the poets, etc. So anyways, that's what I was reminded of. I'm sorry, I've cut you off.
Have you read Sven Berkert's The Gutenberg Elegies?
I have not.
I think you might find him a very congenial mind. He was writing in 1994. It was incredibly prescient about the ways in which electronic communication, the speed and the networked nature of it, was going to change how we read and how we wrote. And that was published 30 years ago. To speak about your preferred reading period. And he makes the argument that we're losing that reading at its most valuable provides a space for subjectivity, a private self, a private depth of self that allows us to seek wisdom, to develop it in ourselves, and so on and so forth. And he also observes that some of his students in his courses are reading the way they would watch movies, not reading to develop that depth of self, but just reading for content, for plot, for characters, and so on and so forth. And that is the trend that I think is a lot more common now than the way that you read now. Not the active kind of reading, but the passive. There is a very strong strain of passive consumption that I think people do not necessarily know alternatives to. And yeah, I do think reading can allow for the creation of that subjective world. That George Eliot's Middlemarch is the construction of an entire alternative universe inside your mind.
Yes.
But that I don't find that, and I think Burkert's predicted it. There's a shallowness to a lot of text today that doesn't allow for me to develop that sense of space. I could also just be articulating a complaint that everyone has had over the past 100 years, because I'm not reading all the penny novels of each decade. I'm reading what remained, and that's a selection bias right there. But I do think there is a loss. I do think there's a loss of depth. I do think there's a loss of subjectivity, of that kind of creative imagination. So many books I read these days, I have the sense that the author made certain choices to appeal to the current public moral judgment. And that specifically Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own is going through book after book of women's fiction and noting that in every single one, the contemporary prejudices and complaints and frustrations of the writer were coming through into the novel in a way that was not organic and natural to the book itself. I think she found at one point, I can't remember which book it was, one book that simply was whole and of itself and not imposed upon by externalities. And she says that she identified one of the obstacles to women's writing as just the massive injustice that women have to go through, that can obtrude into the fiction as moralizing, as reactivity. And I do think, as you're saying, we are. There's a reader I like and respect, and at one point we were talking about a particular book, and I heard him say, well, I think this book is condoning this kind of abuse because bad things do not happen to this character who does this. And I'm like, that is not how any of this works. That is not how books work. But that is increasingly the worldview that is coming across readership, where people assume that if the villain is not punished in the end sufficiently for his crimes, then the author clearly supports the crimes. There's just this loss of imagination, this loss of creativity, this loss of nuance, this loss of grace, this loss of understanding. We've come to an extremely simplified moral vocabulary, and it's not serving anyone. Well, it is not serving anyone of good faith.
Yeah, I totally hear what you mean here. This was, I'm teetering on the brink of, I want to recommend you something that I did read recently that is coming out very recently that I'm tremendously excited about. But about that idea of just like the constraining of the sort of, it is a constraining of the imagination, but I think it's particularly insidious because it masquerades as a laudable use of the imagination, right? It is a sort of so this is like a diminishment of the idea that, you know, you can do things with fiction besides bluntly represent the world that you desire, right? That there are things that fiction can do in terms of making you feel things, in terms of bringing you wonder or fear, or in a controlled environment, or to, and again, even saying these things, I feel like I might be treading slightly too close towards this sort of utilitarian perspective of literature that I'm actually very suspicious of. And I feel like it comes out of, I don't know, decades of the humanities sort of trying to justify their own existence with reference to their utility and stuff like that. Incidentally, I said 20 to 30 years ago in terms of the books that I want to read, and realizing as I say that I said 20 to 30 years ago, I actually meant 40 to 50 years ago. I just failed to do that math, because 20 to 30 years ago, surely that's the 80s. I don't know. It's not. It's absolutely not that time. But yeah, so all this to say that I appreciate this sense that, like, we are often closing off avenues of what fiction can do, essentially. Like, it's technology that we have. I do think I want to go back to this for a second. Then, when you're talking about empathy, right? I sort of feel like I just want to kind of, because I think you walked this back a little bit. You were saying that stories are not, the means of producing empathy in people, but stories are tools that are neutral and stuff. So I just wanted to kind of come back at that and say they can, I think, instruct you in empathy, or they can be instructive, they can be pedagogical, but that they also can create avenues for empathy where they might not have existed before, but they're not easy to predict in that way. Like, I have read books where I, started out hating a character and ended up loving the character, and I could not have predicted that was the path it was going to take, or that I am emerging from this book with a kind of sense of, oh, I don't know, I'm inventing a scenario here where I have a different perspective on something as a consequence of having read the book. I think that those are very difficult to predict, and that we often have rhetoric around being an author, I guess, that tries to simplify this path when it's really not. But I also kind of want to bring this back to the question of your own book and stuff, and recognizing that you have this view of the sort of moral imagination being constrained in current conversations around books and stuff. But your book is taking up, a matter of a tremendous injustice in the world, and is addressing that, and is addressing it by sort of showing it very granularly as an experience. And I'd love to hear you speak to, like, how you see the relationship there. Also, is there a cat near you by any chance?
There's a cat. I was trying to convince her not to do that.
What a sweetheart. But yeah. But so I just love to hear you speak to, like, that difference. I mean, to me, you've written something that is addressing a great injustice, but also we're suspicious of narratives about fiction's utility being, the addressing of great injustice and stuff like that. And I'd love to know how you triangulate that.
So I apologize for repeating this to you. You've read the essay in which I have quoted H.L. Mencken's Puritanism as a Literary Force. I believe that was the title, from his 1917 collection of essays, where he writes about how it's a very American feature that we have, for maybe 150 years now, cared deeply about the moral content and the moral quality of our fiction in a way that absolutely crushes writers. How, because of the Comstock laws, you could be imprisoned for years if you sent a copy of Ulysses through the mail, or the 1001 Nights, because we are so obsessed with having morally pure literature. And he identifies this as the reason that American literature is often so puerile, so dilute, so uninteresting, because we have that Puritan strain that does not exist in Europe, where you can simply write novels to explore life, and you do not have to posit good things happening to good people and bad things happening to bad people. And we've basically forgotten the kinds of constraints that were imposed on our literature through the Comstock laws, some of which are still in the books today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what we're seeing, a secular resurgence of that exact same spirit. And I don't like it one bit. I don't think it's good for books. I don't think it's good for readers. I don't think it's good for writers. As to empathy, it is a word I find myself increasingly allergic to, thanks to I think Edwin Freeman's Failure of Nerve. It was a 1997 book, the last he wrote. It was not finished at the time of his death. He points out very clearly that empathy was not a word that was much in vogue before the 1980s. Before the 1980s, we had the word compassion.
Really?
And the idea of feeling other people's feelings being a virtue is an incredibly recent one. And I do not believe that it is a virtue. I do not benefit from other people thinking they feel my feelings. I benefit from other people's compassion, from their kindness, from their wisdom, from their courageous action. I do not think empathy is, I don't think it's particularly valuable. I think it's necessary. If you are unable to feel an empathy for other people, you are sociopathic, but I don't think it is this extraordinary quality. I think it is like nails in a house. You just have to assume that there are nails in a house because you're in trouble if they aren't there. And that is not at all what we should be seeking. That is not at all what we should be developing. I think we've forgotten how to look for wisdom. I think we've forgotten to look for courage. And people in general right now, we valorize our feelings so much that I have watched in many situations other people try to declare their feelings as reality, such that they would assert things that had never happened because that is what they wished to feel. And I am for this reason not interested in writing to create empathy, because again, if you need to read to feel empathy for other people, good God, by all means do it. But you're 1 to 4% of the population, and you should probably cultivate other virtues as well. I write in part to understand, to be understood, and to give some courage and some hope where it can be very difficult to find any. At least that is how I flatter myself. I think writers are sometimes the least informed people in being able to speak about what they try to do, what they manage to do, and what is actually accomplished. I think in the end, reading is a very collaborative project between the reader and the writer. And in the end, you have no control over what happens, over the alchemy that happens when a person experiences a text. I know what I hope. I know what I can hope for, but I have no control and no knowledge of what happens next.
That's so lovely. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to be mulling over that distinction between compassion and empathy for some time, not least because it's making me aware of how tremendously egotistical the idea of empathy is in comparison, in that, the idea of feeling someone else's feelings sort of requires you to obliterate them and replace them with yourself, right? I mean, the idea
I feel angry, and then you empathize with me, and you also feel angry. We are both worse off.
Oh, this explains so much about Twitter. Oh no,
oh
no, I'm literally having a real-time epiphany here about I have often thought, so this is an interesting thing as well, I think, in terms of reading. I think there is a way of talking about reading that sort of assumes reading as contagion. This idea that if you expose yourself to certain kinds of literature, then something is going to happen to you. And this is also, I think, a very puritanical way of looking at it. And I think that some people who feel this way about literature would be very surprised to find who they have that in common with, essentially, in terms of it being a very, I don't know.
Books as vitamins, books as Metamucil. What a romantic and charming idea.
Right. But yeah, and yet I have to say, I mean, as as much as I have just said that, I do also recognize that when you start out being a writer, you do, I think, so this was true for me. Um, it's not, the truism is that you write what you know, but it's not really. You don't write what you know, you write what you've read, right? Like I certainly, when I was starting out, I wanted to write like the people who I had read. And so there was a real sense in which what I had read had constituted some part of me, had constituted something foundational and stuff. But that's something that's a work in progress. I wonder, have you read, there's an article called Data and Wisdom by Julia Flanders.
No, please send it to me after
I will
this.
send it to you. It's a digital humanities paper, and I learned, it's sort of something I keep on thinking about because I think about it all the time whenever conversations about representation come up, because I feel like that word is it has many overlapping meanings that sort of that involve a lot of sleight of hand when people use it and they don't necessarily realize it. So it's an article that is basically talking about it's ostensibly talking about the humanities' suspicion of data, of the idea that there is something that is lost if you try to look at a book as a data set of some kind that, and it opens with a comparison to or a reference to Borges's Book of Sand and stuff like that. And it's very beautiful. I love this piece. But one of the core things that it says is that anytime that you make a model of something, there is necessary loss. That a map of the London Underground is not useful for navigating the topography of London itself, right? You've made a model of this network of tunnels and you've represented it in such a way that it is useful for this one tool, but it is not useful for this other thing. Likewise, a topographical survey map is not going to help you ride the subway, right?
I'm laughing because for my day job, I write data science courses and I finished a geospatial one.
Really?
In December or so, and one on the ways that data misleads us in January. Long story.
This is amazing. So this is the thing that one of the things that she says that I love is that you have to understand that any representation is never going to be a one-for-one representation at scale of everything. It's a representation. You have to comprehend the loss as strategic, that you are deliberately losing some element in order to foreground another element for a purpose and stuff.
Mark Lemonier's How to Lie with Maps is the classic book on generalization and cartography and the ways that maps lie. Soviet Russia in particular, was very fond of moving villages around. You could see, like, on this year, this particular village was on the right side of the delta. This year was on the southwest of the delta. It's a fantastic book if you want to understand how maps are made. The basic core of the book is every single map is a white lie. It has to be. It has to tell you lots of white lies in order to be useful.
Absolutely.
It absolutely has to leave out everything irrelevant to your current purpose, or you would be overwhelmed.
Exactly. And there's a sense in which, like, in order for us to process information, we need models, right? We need to make models of the information that we have. This is part of how we process information. I say we here in terms of, like, humanity and stuff. We create patterns, we pattern match, we're apophenic, we move through the world making these sort of models for ourselves, and they end up obscuring things, right? If we don't end up reinvestigating them periodically and stuff. And I find myself thinking of that whenever a conversation about representation comes up, because I always end up thinking, well, what is the nature of a monument except, as soon as it's raised, it casts a shadow, it obscures something as well. And that these ways that we have of demanding certain things of our literature are in service of a certain model of the world, of, like, our ability to change it and stuff like that, that is its own kind of fantasy, I think. And anyway, I'm treading in some weeds here.
Fantasy. No, I think the fantasy lies in the etymology of the word itself. Representare, to show again. It's another form of putting on a public face. It is not something I very much care about. I care about inequities and gatekeeping in publishing and the ways in which good work is kept from coming into the world. But I find the PR job, that is putting out as many positive representations of one's own culture as possible, I am so much less interested in that as an artist and a human being. Does it have some effect? Perhaps, but that's not what my work is. That is not what I'm concerned with.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a lovely place to pause and turn to some questions in order to, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So here's a question from Gretchen Loves Books, which is great. So the question is, child points of view can be really difficult to capture. They often sound like little adults, but not Fairuzi. How did you discover her narrative voice?
I am a very unreliable narrator about the process of writing this book because I started in 2011 or so, and my memory it fills and it empties, and it fills and it empties, and it holds what I need to know at a particular time, but not others. She always was who she was, and it was just a matter of getting closer to an accurate expression of that.
That's wonderful. I like that. Was there?
I think that was the one question I saw.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you have any questions, do feel free to. Actually, I presume people are dropping them in the YouTube chat or the Facebook live chat and stuff, where I think this is being broadcast. I want to ask another question about Fairuzi, actually. When you say like she was always kind of this one voice and stuff, was that true of all the other characters, or was she a kind of core one and the other ones sort of generated themselves around her?
At one point in the book, there's a draft of the book in which there were 4 points of view, every single member of the family. It was much, much too noisy, too anxious in the parents. I had to drop down to Firuze's because it was simple and quiet. But if you're an adult and you're in that situation, you are thinking 100,000 things at once, and it was impossible to keep that going. I will say I was probably the last person to figure out something very critical about Noor. All the prior events were already in the book, and I was driving in the car one day and essentially had a shoulder tap and just this quiet little whisper, the quiet little voice at the center of everything being like, by the way, you should know that. And I was like, wait, what? Oh no, you're right. It had been there the entire time, and I was the last person to figure it out. And part of that drive was just arguing with God for a while, being like, you understand that this means that there will be nobody who is not angry with me. You understand what you're asking of me is to like thoroughly cut off any possibility of anyone supporting this book ever. All right, okay, let's go with. But I think what was astonishing to me was that I could write all of that and not figure it out until basically then I had to go back in and put a particular conversation in, but wow. It was all there. It was all there.
That's amazing. Actually, this is a weird stylistic question that I have for you. So this is a book that's written with no, like, stylistically, you choose not to use quotation marks and stuff like that. And usually I would find this question very tedious because whatever, it's a style thing. But in this case, I was very, very aware of the fact that my reading of the book felt very, very quiet. It just felt like all of these voices I was experiencing these characters and their voices differently because there was no punctuation differentiating who was speaking when and stuff. And I was wondering how you came to that choice, or whether that is, because I've read your short fiction and that's not a facet of the short fiction so far as I'm remembering, is it?
Well, Monsters plays a little bit.
But yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about like that choice for you?
It happened so far back that I am not entirely sure I'm the most reliable narrator on the subject, but the way I wanted the book experienced was something like an injection, something like a direct line to the heart, so to speak. If you've read Virginia Woolf's The Hours, it is a river that you sink into and it sweeps you away. And that was something of the effect that I was going for. And there are stones in there that you climb out onto. There are quotation marks in other chapters, and you can climb out and rest on that stone for a while. But for the effect that I was going for the two or three killing blows that I was arranging, I needed people to be able to read the novel in such a way that I needed the novel to be able to teach people how to read it. For me, that is one of the qualities of all the really great books. It takes you a while to understand how to read them, because they are new things in and of themselves. And so they are not approached in the same way that we approach other books. Right. And that was one of my ways of getting at what was essentially neurosurgery. How do I slide in under preconceptions, under defenses, under expectations, and reach people where they maybe have not gone so deeply before? That was what I was trying to do.
And personally, I think it worked a treat. So
it's not for everybody. Yeah. No book is for everybody. It'd be a very boring world if it were.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, this is something that I wish we had more appreciation for as well. This is something else that, anyway, but I will defer to questions coming from the chat. So Jessica Finn is asking, were there any big changes to the novel during the drafting process besides multiple points of view?
Oh, tremendously. There were 4 drafts of the novel. 2 of them were in longhand. The draft before the final version, which then went through a couple of line edits. The draft before the final version was 100,000 words long. The final version is 50,000 words.
What? Sorry, what? I have difficulty processing this. Did you, what did you
4 times.
4
times I threw away the entire novel. 3 times. Sorry, 3 times. The 4th was the final draft. 3 times I threw away everything I'd written before. And
did you
find... I started over.
Okay, so I'm going to use it's an awkward metaphor here. Was this sort of like, were the changes that you were making in terms of rewriting it, sort of like, smithing a knife, where you're just kind of putting layer after layer after layer of metal on it and stuff until it is sharp? I don't actually know how to make a knife. I just have this metaphor in my head.
I would say it's like making 4 knives. You make a knife, it comes out terribly, you toss it out, you try again, it comes out terribly, you toss it out, you try again, and maybe on the 4th try, it works. Knives are easier than books. Knives are easier than books.
Yes, indeed. But so I just have so many more questions thinking about this. Also, hilariously, Marty saying "Lily, excuse me" very loudly in all caps.
But to what you were saying before, there's a very American quality, which is demanding public approbation of our own personal choices and our own personal tastes, where we don't have the courage to say, I like this, and I just like it. People are demanding that everyone else must like the same things that I do and dislike the same things that I do to validate my choices, because I don't have the courage to stand alone behind my choices. And that is why I think there are a lot of people who resist the idea that some books can be for some people and not for others. Absolutely. And that some books can be like absolutely miraculous world changers for some people, but not everybody. There was an agent who I was very fond of, who did not want the novel, and when Marcus Hoffman took it, he said, "Oh, well, I must have missed something." I said, "Not necessarily. It's just possible that you like completely different things, and that is fine. That is why we have this wide universe of literature in which everyone can find a home." Absolutely. One hopes.
What exactly? And I feel like to speak to your earlier points about gatekeeping and publishing and so on, one of the things that this does is places enormous pressure on any member of any marginalized group to constantly represent and stuff, and to constantly have their choices, their personal individual tastes and choices, somehow stand in for the tastes and choices of a community, as if that could be a thing, as if, you know, a community could have one singular taste. And this is like the book that is approved by the gays, and this is the book that is approved by the brown people, and this is, you know, it just doesn't, it's a truly impossible sort of thing to have fulfilled. People have different tastes and are, you know, contain multitudes and are magnificent concatenations of difference and stuff. And it's why, to me, it is so wonderful and enchanting to find that I have the same taste as another person in a book, or to find that people like have enjoyed a book that I have enjoyed. And I think a huge part of that, to me as a critic, is trying to speak as clearly and honestly about the experience of a book as possible, but also to try and make myself into a book's ideal reader whenever I read one, and to just be able to speak to it so that it can hopefully find the people who will love it and who will cherish it and stuff. But yeah, it's not fair. It's just not fair to demand otherwise of people. Also, can I just say, I don't know if you've had this experience. Hopefully you haven't, because you are extremely wisely not on social media. But there are some things that I absolutely love that I don't feel I can talk about loving, because they are, I don't know, they're associated with bad things. I don't know. Like, I would literally one time, I'm gonna say this here and be excoriated for it at some point, probably. I love Rick and Morty, the television show. I think it's a brilliant show. I think it is caustic. It is often vicious, but it's a brilliant show. And the one time I ventured to like express this opinion on our internet, someone called me a fascist. And I was like, I feel like I disagree. I disagree very strongly, but I mean, it's just one of those things. It's like, no, you like this thing, ergo, you must, I don't know. There were many failures of logic, I think, in that progression, but it sure did make me not want to talk about it in public.
I think this has been the case for thousands of years. It is always so much easier and cheaper and safer to denounce other people for what they say and what they like and any small slip-ups than it is to have the courage to stand in your own convictions, to develop strong character, and to be responsible for your own choices. The latter takes decades, and it will cost you a great deal. Being able to denounce other people for what they like and for what they say and for what they do, that costs you nothing. The worst people I know in person look like absolute angels on social media. I've seen that from the beginning, from about 2012 or so. And so I've never taken seriously the performances, the presentations, the representations of self as pure virtue. I think anybody who is honest with themselves knows how easy it is to hurt other people, how easy it is to fall short of your own values in the day by day. And there's grace. If you know that about yourself, you are able to offer grace and forgiveness to other people. And those who don't tend to be the loudest, tend to be the most popular, because there is a very ugly part of us that enjoys feeling morally superior, that enjoys feeling outraged, because it's so much easier to feel than to be.
Yeah. Oh, I can't think of Jim saying, but everybody loves child ballads. Oh.
Some of them are very problematic, Jim.
It's true. It's true. I will. You know what? Just for like a palate cleanser after everything, I would love to talk about child ballads for a second. We briefly chatted beforehand, before we started this, saying, what if we talked about plants or birds or child ballads? And we have talked about none of those things.
We talked about morality instead.
Actually, you know, here's the thing. I would love to just kind of just strong arm this conversation in this direction, briefly at least. Am I remembering correctly that you have a fondness for birds? Or is that just me?
Small fondness. I'm a very, very amateur book birder.
Me too. Me too. So this is kind of what I wanted to say is I have been trying to make slowly the transition from being a book birder to like birding by ear and stuff. And it is reminding me so much of it's actually reminding me of nothing so much as the acquisition of language, like of studying another language. Recently I was in the woods in a cabin and it was snowing and there was a bird feeder and it was amazing. And I found myself going out outside and just like staring at this bird feeder and watching these birds and how tremendously peaceful and beautiful it was to do this. But I also found myself, trying to pay attention to, okay, these are birds that I know by sight. I want to try and listen to their particular voices, their particular calls. And I found that as I was doing that, it was activating parts of my brain that activated when learning a new language, specifically that moment where you start to put vocabulary into sentences. And it was tremendous. And becoming aware of this kind of made me tear up a little bit. It was just like, no, I'm not learning the language of the birds. I'm not going to be able to understand chickadees and what they say to each other. But being able to associate a sound with an image in this way is a kind of reading. It meant that there was a legibility that was taking place all of a sudden that I hadn't had before. And that felt tremendous. And I'm just wondering, like, if you've felt anything similar and you're beginning to kind of tell me about your amateur birding, essentially.
Legibility is exactly right. You're going to ask me a question about future projects, and what is hilarious is that we've basically covered the ground for one of our projects in this conversation. But I will talk about two things. I know the sound of red-winged blackbirds, which are very common where I am by heart. Essentially, they're singing their names to you. Yeah. Like you're walking through the woods, and they are there because you recognize the song. I think I was proudest of, however, there's this one afternoon about a month ago. I had a very tough day at work, and I took a walk in the afternoon, and I heard this sound, like a very small dental drill. And 2 feet beside the path was an Anna's hummingbird, its face flashing red and black in the way that it does. And I just stood there for 3 minutes and listened to it. And about a week later, I was getting the mail, and I heard a sound like a small dental drill. And I just stood and I listened for it, and I was able to figure out which branch it was on. And it was because I knew the sound because I had listened to it for 3 minutes, that I was eventually able to see the very tiny body perched on a very small twig on a very large branch of a tree. The world becomes legible if you listen to it, if you learn names, if you learn presences, if you learn beings, in birds, in plants, in mushrooms, in the pattern of water flows, in the clouds, the lenticular clouds that gather over Mount Rainier. When I finally learned their name from a meteorologist, I was just a meteorologist on a mycological field trip. I was just so delighted because all I could describe was like that hooded call of sorts that was hanging over the mountain, just like an inverted bowl. The world is as alive to us as a book, and I think we would be. Unlike just any book, I do think we would be better off as people, as a society, if we went back to the old ways of reading and knowing some of those things.
I love that. I really do. Do you by any chance, well, I know you're not on social media, but I don't know how, whether you follow other people or not, but there are some really wonderful forager accounts.
I mostly run away from other people.
Mostly run away, that's fair.
I'm in my local mycological society, and I would recommend that for anybody else who is interested.
That's excellent. I do actually need to look up. I'm sure there are some, is the thing. So I don't know what my local mycological societies are, but I do know that my mom is perhaps slightly too into just foraging for mushrooms without, in a way that makes me very nervous, essentially. But
it may be your responsibility to learn everything in your area.
Exactly. But no, there are some sort of public facing foragers who I tremendously admire and who are very, very fun, and who, are doing the kind of work of, there's a kind of public education work that I find are doing in ways that I am very engaged by, and that certainly has made me more aware of ways to interact with my immediate environment. That is one thing too that I'll say about, the one of the small things that I am grateful for. Well, I guess one has to say grateful. I mean, I'm not grateful for a pandemic. I do not think that, but because of having been forced to stay in one place for as long as we have, I don't think that I had spent one whole year in one place without traveling. I literally cannot remember, probably not since my early childhood. And experiencing every moment of every season in this one place has made me feel so much closer to it and has made me learn things about it that I would not have otherwise. And I am glad of that. And just something as simple as, being in Ottawa when the lilacs bloom is something that I hadn't had since I was a child. And that's usually always a time when I was traveling. And in this case, getting to be here meant that I could A, appreciate them, B, harvest some and make syrup out of them. And
that too this year.
Yes. And it's just it made me realize too, like, just how much it felt like writing, to go out and gather something and then steep that something for a while and make something different from that thing that I had gathered. It felt like there's, it made me think of writing as something that you can either distill or dilute. You go out and you gather things and you bring them, and either you can make that experience more potent somehow, or you can diffuse that experience somehow. And I liked thinking of it that way. I liked thinking of like having this in common with bees, going out and gathering and transforming the thing that you've gathered into something totally different. And I don't know, little things like that, little insights like that, I feel very grateful for. But anyway, do you have, this is a ridiculous question, but I'm going to try and steer us towards something like an ending, even though I just want to keep talking to you.
I know.
Do you have, in your environment, maybe this is too personal and feel free to not answer, but I'm just curious to know if, like, in your environment, there is an element of plant or bird or mineral or something that you feel a particular affinity for, or a pleasure in the company of, or I hesitate to say favorite because that is weird, but is there just like some one thing that you have an experience with that you want to share? Maybe I'll put it that way instead.
There are so many that it feels like really cruel favoritism.
Right, that's what I'm trying to avoid, but yeah.
To choose one, Terry Pratchett writes that witches are determined by the rock that they grow up on. For me, for some reason, that is basalt. Long story there. I see herons, swans, wood ducks, American coots, red-winged blackbirds, I spotted two spotted towhees in the past 3 days. It's very hard. It's very hard to say, oh, I love the muskrat more than the beaver, or the other way around. What I am very grateful for is how much is given back to me in the sky, in the water, in the woods, and how much of that I am able to reach. I wasn't always able to.
I think that's lovely and very fair to all the elements that you have named and involved, basically.
So you had an introduction published to Tor's Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm sorry, I forgot the subtitle.
Worlds of Exile and Delusion, I think is the
Some Exile and Illusion. What are your next projects?
Oh my gosh. I have a short story that I'm working on for oh, actually, I don't know if I can announce this project or not. Well, I'm working on a short story for an anthology that someone is putting together. I'm working on an audio original short story that I'm very excited about. Actually, um, it's a retelling of the Bonnie Swans, bringing it back to murder ballads. Actually, I don't know if that one counts as well, there's a murder in it. But I have had a bone to pick with that ballad as it were, for a very long time. But I love it, and I just want to retell it in a way that satisfies the honor of the older sister. And so yeah, I am an older sister, and it always troubles me, or it doesn't trouble me. It makes me sad when I see the kind of default relationship between sisters in literature as an antagonistic one, because my relationship with my sister is tremendously close, and we love each other very, very much. And
Patriarchy.
Yeah, it's true. Yes, it's very true. And but so that is a ballad in which like the older sister kills her younger sister for love of a man and stuff. And I was like, that makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. So I'm having my way with it, and I'm going to rewrite it. And so those are the two kind of closest ones. There's always the kind of there's a novel that I'm working on very, very, very slowly that is about reading. Essentially, it's about the experience of reading, except that is not a pitch. So I'm sure that at some point between now and when it's finished, it will be packaged in a content-based way for a public face, so that it's not so much just like, well, it's my love letter to reading and also my deep sadness about reading and stuff. But I'm much more interested in knowing the same for you, Lily. I mean, because partly, and let me just reiterate this to be totally embarrassing. On Fragile Waves is a book that feels like a career to me. Like, it feels like just so enormously complete, such an enormous statement in and of itself. So it stands completely alone to me. Like, it is like a mountain. And I want to know, like, what do you even, I sort of want to ask you, what do you even want to do after this? Like, having accomplished this.
Honestly, that book felt like a gift that I was used to bring into the world, but was not necessarily something I can claim is mine, or it's a strange relationship. I am going to glare vaguely in Marty's direction because I don't think I'm allowed to say something about a certain thing. Marty, consider yourself glared at. But I was actually right before this conversation, I was working through revisions on a non-book project. I'm just going to show you the back of it. But this is what I did with the novel. Actually, when I really hit a breaking point, you just write down everything on 1/6 index cards, spread it across the floor. Thank God you have no roommates, and just figure out what went wrong, where structurally.
For the benefit of the audio, I'm just going to say that what Lily just did was essentially hold out a sort of accordion of index cards that had been carefully and cleverly pasted together in ways that dazzle me. So,
right. So I can be vague. Martin says. Well, vaguely, Martin is not letting me talk about a thing. I think for another few weeks, but once the non-book project is finished, I have a nonfiction book proposal out to my agent who is traveling right now, but it is about, in some small part, reading a lot of the things we talked about today.
Oh, wonderful!
Reading with nuance and depth, reading the world, reading books as opposed to reading scripture. There's this beautiful There's this beautiful thing that Rachel Held Evans wrote in one of her books that just stopped me dead, where she wrote, people read the parables not as literal statements of truth, but for provocation, as seeds for conversation and thought. And I thought, dear gods, if that is the state of current Bible scholarship, I'm reading that Bible scholars are doing a better job of reading in depth with nuance and comfort with ambiguity than many fiction readers. And that was a moment where I had to step back and go, well, that just upset all my expectations.
Wow.
So I have a proposal up for that. I'm not going to talk about the thing I have not started yet, except to say that it is going to be typographically extremely challenging.
Ooh. Ooh, we love a typographical challenge.
So yeah, I would just, the last thing I did was, sorry, time is a little bit spidery. The last work that came out that I think was, that's not quite it, was Small Bonds. There, I had stories in the 2 anthologies. In March, Lost Worlds and Mythological Kingdoms. In February, Shadow Atlas. In October, Small Monsters came out, a novella, novelette, sorry, at Tor.com. And in September was the streaming, and you can find it on YouTube, of Stars Between, the 20-minute short opera I did with Stephen Tran for the Seattle Opera's Creation Lab. I would really, really love if another opera commissioned us to do the full-length one, because we always envisioned it at full length, but I don't know who will. So
wonderful. It sounds like a very beautiful constellation of things to have all.
It's a little bit much, to be honest.
Well, that sounds really, really exciting. One thing I will say, if I may shout this out, I am a subscriber to a particularly fantastic newsletter called The Paper Airplane, which is your newsletter.
Amal's newsletter is called Amal Content. Full of birds and joy.
But I really want to encourage people to subscribe to the newsletter, partly because, I mean, I presume you will talk about all of your future projects and things in there, but also just because you write essays there that I think are tremendous and that are food for thought for months after and stuff.
I make terrible puns.
You also make wonderful wordplay that is, the kind of wonderful wordplay that sometimes gets called terrible. But the puns, crucially, are footnoted, which I feel goes a long way towards reconciling me personally to them. And they're always,
excuse me, reconciling you to puns. Miss Whacked Seal.
It's true. Mine is called a malcontent. I mean, it's really a number of people who out of the blue will message me to say, I just got the pun in your newsletter title. And I'm like, oh, I forgot it was.
How does that compare to the number of people who hit the Whacked Seal letter?
That is true.
This is how you lose a time war, and let you know about that, because that was you, wasn't it?
Was it? I think Max's, I think the pun may have been collaborative. It is Red who makes the pun. I think, yes. I'm pretty sure it's Red who makes the pun. But it feels shared because, Blue is the one who receives the pun, Red is the one who makes it. It's the whole thing. But anyway, Lily, I could talk to you for literally ever.
We've gone over time.
This is so much fun. We've definitely gone over time. But thank you so much for this conversation. I'm so excited to see On Fragile Waves continue to make waves and to move through the world. And I'm just so excited to see all of the things that you have coming up next. And just your work in the world is such a gift. And I really, really appreciate you sharing it. So thank you so much.
Thank you to Jim, to Amy, and to Barbara for having us. And Amal, just thank you for the beautiful and generous way in which you read everything, the world, literature, and you're just On Fragile Waves, I think, would be nowhere without your support. And thank you for that.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
Yes, and I want to thank both of you. I think this is one of the most fascinating conversations we've hosted. I'm going to be thinking about it for quite a long time. Thank you to E. Lily Yu and Amal El-Mohtar for bringing us their ideas and wisdom. Jim Freund was producer. Amy Goldschlager was audience wrangler. And thanks again to Martin Cahill, who helped put together this event on behalf of Erewhon Books. Next, May 3rd, we will be bringing you Robert V.S. Reddick. My name is Barbara Krasnoff. And thanks again to everyone who was here. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.